Perfect. All right, so can you repeat again who's there?
Okay, you've got Alaric and Frank, you've got Pat and Paul, you've got Jennifer and Louie, and Ray and Dana.
Very nice. Well, I'm excited to be able to virtually spend some time with you guys. Like I just said, yeah, I just realized last night, it's been a full year now since we moved. So it's been a good year, a long year, but we do miss coming back and seeing you guys. There's some fantastic work that you're all doing, and we miss the friendship and the love. So instead, we get to talk with each other, which is also good. So what we're going to be talking about for the next 6 weeks, 6 classes, I'm excited because it's important stuff. So we're going to be looking at the time of the crucifixion. So we'll get into it a little bit later, but really this is kind of the crux of everything, right? The entire Bible is pointing to these seminal moments that happened during Jesus' crucifixion. So by stories at the cross, each week we'll be pulling out a different event that happened at the cross. It could only be a sentence, could only be a small action that happened, but at such a pivotal time in history, there's a lot of meaning behind that. So we're really going to spend a lot of time looking at what's going on at the time of the crucifixion, what Jesus is doing, and we're going to learn a lot about who Jesus is, a lot about salvation, a lot about how we can have a deeper understanding of the cross and what that means, and of course, how to live that in our own lives. So tonight, we'll get into it later, but we're going to talk about the wine vinegar, all right? So I was very sad when I exhorted in Champaign a couple months ago. I think only one person remembered when I gave this talk in Champaign. So I gave an exhortation on this very topic maybe 3-4 years ago. It was before we moved to Champaign. And this is honestly my favorite study I've ever done of anything. So we're in for a good treat tonight. It's been a while now since I first studied it, but more and more I have seen a lot more deeper connections with it. So first off, when we think about the Bible, in essence, the Bible is a history book. It's absolutely divinely inspired. God had a huge hand. He wrote the Bible through humans, but it's still a history book. And the concept of history, or being a historian, is interesting, because we like to think that history is very objective, that historians write what they see, what happens, right? When actually, there's a famous quote, history is written by the victors, right? And that's very true, because all authors bring their own biases to the table, right? Even in our own lives, we record, we write down, we mention what we think is important, right? Now, everything happened, lots of things happen in our life, but when I come home and talk with Abigail about my day, I don't mention, oh, I had, a moderately good water bottle. No, I talk about the important things that happened in the day. And the Bible's the same way, where it's impossible to write down everything that happened during Jesus' life or during the course of the Bible. In the book of John, it says, and there were also many things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. Now, before I go on, is this coming through fine audio-wise? Is it catching? Am I talking too fast?
Oh, fine.
Good. All right, so the concept is whenever you have to pick and choose what events to record as important, there's going to be biases. And we're privileged because the biased writer of the Bible is God. And if I want anyone's biases or anyone who says, hey, here's what I think is important, I'll take God's opinion on that, right? There's a whole bunch of concepts where in the study of history, they aim for objectivity. They like to think it's a science, but really it's not. Here's a quote by John Arnold. He says, if we accept that truth does not require a capital T, we can try and present truth, or rather truths, plural, in their contingent complexity. In other words, you present your own version of an event that you see, what you deem important, relevant, and useful, right? And what you don't deem important, relevant, and useful, you don't include. So for the next 6 weeks, we're going to look at that pivotal time in history when Jesus was crucified. So in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it spends a lot of time focusing on Jesus' crucifixion, as you would imagine. So if you look at the time period from when Jesus first goes to Pilate so he's tried, he's beaten, he's found guilty, he's crucified, sentenced to the cross, goes to the cross, he hangs on the cross, he dies, and then Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea bury him. All right, so from the time that he goes to Pilate, the judge, until he's buried in the grave, a lot of stuff happens. So we'll go over this quickly. Each book in the New Testament, they have their own version of the different events that happen in this time slot. But what I want to see is which ones did all four of these gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, again, they all had their own biases, they all had their own perspectives on what they deemed was important. So I'm curious, what did all four of them say, hey, this is really crucial that our audience needs to read about? So you line them all up. So this on the screen are events that are recorded in at least two of the gospel books, all right? And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they more or less align with each other. They're called the synoptic gospels because they record very similar events. So not many things were removed from their account. How about if an event is recorded in at least three gospels? All right. So in other words, let's take the second from the bottom here in Matthew. Centurion or soldiers realize that Jesus is the Son of God. That is in Matthew, Mark, and right here, Luke, but it is not in John. All right, so we go to the next one, and these are the events that are in all four Gospels. All right, and for the next 6 weeks, these are the events that we're going to be looking at. The fact that he was crucified at Golgotha, that's mentioned, that place is mentioned. The fact that his clothes were divided by the soldiers who were there. All four Gospels mention that there's a sign next to the cross identifying Jesus and saying something along the lines of, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. All four Gospels mention that he was crucified along with other criminals. It wasn't just Jesus who was crucified. There were other people around. Tonight we'll look at the small little seemingly throwaway detail that Jesus was offered wine vinegar on a sponge. All right? And the last one is that all four Gospels record that at the crucifixion, there were women there who were watching Jesus. All right, so this is our outline for the next 6 weeks, not in this order, but these are the 6 events we'll be talking about. All right, so it's a study on Jesus. We're going to see him completed and perfected by his death at the cross, where really his life journey is complete. And so our view of Jesus should hopefully change, become more full and more rich. So let's start, before we go on, by looking at Matthew chapter 27, all right? So we're going to be talking about the wine vinegar today. And again, remember, a historian records what is important, okay? So Matthew 27, verses 45 to 48. The most important time in human history, I would argue. Matthew 27:45. Now from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, this man is calling for Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave him a drink. And then it goes on, and 2 verses later, Jesus dies. So this is interesting. It's included in all 4 accounts, but this is weird. I mean, it's kind of like you're building up to a climax, right? You're watching a big movie. There's a big, whatever you call it, the climax, either emotional drama, some type of relational tension, a big battle scene. Then there's a big break in the action, and the main character is given a drink of water. It doesn't make sense, right? This doesn't flow with the natural sense of the account. Why in the world is this so important that he was given wine vinegar that all 4 gospel writers included? Right? Here's a quote. It was the last thing he ever did, that being taking the wine vinegar, it seems, and on those grounds alone, there must be considerable significance. All right, so this is really one of the last events that we ever have recorded that Jesus did, taking a drink. Again, doesn't seem to match. So the goal tonight, we're going to kind of unpack this and figure out why in the world would these 4 gospel writers include this. So there's different thoughts. There's actually not much research out here. This guy, Adam Clark, says this. He says, he's a Methodist. This appears also to have been done in mercy, to alleviate his suffering. And that's the predominant view of the wine vinegar, that Jesus was in deep pain, and he took it to dull his pain. All right? Which, sure, that is fine on the surface, but it's kind of weird. Again, this is the most pivotal time in human history. We have Jesus, and he can't handle the pain right before he dies. It doesn't really make sense, right? Here's another person's point of view. So I know you've talked about this at the Beck before. It's the book Radical by David Platt. I talked about it when I was there. Ray talks about it. So here's what he says that is very interesting. All right. So I'm reading from his book, David Platt, Radical. Picture Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. As he kneels before his Father, drops of sweat and blood fall together from his head. Why is he in such agony and pain? The answer is not because he's afraid of crucifixion. He's not trembling because of what the Roman soldiers are about to do to him. Since that day, countless men and women in the history of Christianity have died for their faith. Some of them were not just hung on crosses, they were burned there. Many of them went to their crosses singing. One Christian in India, while being skinned alive, looked at his persecutors and said, "I thank you for this. Tear off my old garment, for I will soon put on Christ's garment of righteousness." Or another example, as he prepared to head to his execution, Christopher Love wrote a note to his wife, saying, "Today they will sever me from my physical head, but they cannot sever me from my spiritual head, Christ." As he walked to his death, his wife applauded while he sang of glory. Did these men and women in Christian history have more courage than Christ himself? Why was he trembling in the garden, weeping and full of anguish? We can rest assured that he was not a coward about to face Roman soldiers. He goes on to say a couple different thoughts, but I think it does a good job kind of showing the weakness of this thought that, oh, Jesus just couldn't handle it, so he needed to have his pain dulled. That falls very short, I think, in regards to the entire picture of all that's going on. There's actually even another theory that it was the opposite, which some people think it was to increase his pain, all right? Again, I think this is all dealing on the temporal. It's all dealing on something very fleeting during a very, very spiritual moment. So let's figure out what exactly happened, all right? So if you look at a timeline right before Jesus died, and this is a fun slide, so it's color-coded, the different books, because different books, right, they record different events at the cross. So we're going to try and put this in a timeline to figure out what all happened. So we're starting the journey. Jesus is condemned to crucifixion. He is mocked by soldiers and begins his journey to Golgotha. All right, that's in all accounts. While he's walking to Golgotha, Mark's account talks about him refusing the wine mixed with myrrh. All right, let's flip there real quick. It's Mark chapter 15. I think there's value in looking at all these and seeing they're all presented slightly differently. So Mark chapter 15, we'll read verses 20 and 23. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him and put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. All right? So here he's given wine mixed with myrrh, but he refuses it. He does not take this wine vinegar or this wine mixed with myrrh. All right, about this same time, maybe the same event, maybe not, we don't know. In Matthew 27, let's flip back to that account. Very, very similar chronology. But instead of mixed with myrrh, it says it's wine mixed with gall. All right? So Matthew 27, starting at verse 31. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. Sounds similar to Mark. As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. And when they came to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. So again, very similar account. He tastes it. So in Mark, it just says he refused it. Here, he tastes it and then declines it, all right, unwilling to drink. After that, in the chronology, he's crucified. He's nailed to the cross and begins the crucifixion. At that time, while he's on the cross, the soldiers in front of him divide his clothes. We'll look at that later, actually next week. And then passerbys mock him, all right? And after that, we have an example from Luke, which could be in a couple different places. So look at Luke chapter 23. This is what Luke says about this. So Luke chapter 23, verses 36, and again, follows in the story, a little bit later now in the story. Verse 36, the soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him and offering him sour wine. So first, he's given wine mixed with myrrh, and he refuses it. Then he's given it and he tastes, then refuses. Here he's given it, and we do not know whether he takes it or refuses it. Luke doesn't tell us. All right? So that's important to know. It's actually, they use a different Greek word here. They don't use the word wine. They use the word oxos, which is only used to describe this drink that Jesus was given. So what it's referring to a drink called posca, which is sour wine vinegar. All right? It was a common drink that Roman soldiers would use as they marched. It was bitter. I actually made it a couple years ago. You basically crush up a bunch of coriander seeds. You have some water and some honey in it. All right? It doesn't taste very good. You boil it to dissolve the honey. And it's a strong taste, all right? It's very strong. My first thought when I had it was honestly to vomit. It was a very strong, unpleasant taste. It burned badly in the back of my throat. It was bitter. It was not pleasant. But it's what the Romans used in those days. All right, so we don't know the exact timing of Luke's account, but somewhere either before or after that, there's criminals next to Jesus, and Jesus cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And that's what we read in Matthew's account first. All right? And then after that, Matthew, Mark, and John all say that he drinks the wine vinegar. Okay, look back at Mark chapter 15, just to show this. So Mark has already told us that he refused it mixed with mixed with myrrh. But in Mark chapter 15, let's start at verse 35. When some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, Behold, he is calling for Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave him a drink, saying, Let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. All right, same event happens in Matthew, same event happens in John. So here, he's offered the wine vinegar, he accepts and drinks it. All right, John's actually adds some detail. So John, instead of being offered on a sponge, it says it's offered on a branch of hyssop, all right, a branch of hyssop. And then as soon as he takes this drink, Jesus cries out, It is finished. And I think we can say after that, Luke says his last words are, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So what we have, the very last minutes of Jesus' life before his resurrection, takes wine vinegar, takes the posca, cries, It is finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, and he dies. All right? So that's really the timeline we have. He's offered it, or some version of a wine vinegar, multiple times in his last couple of hours of life. He declines it sometimes, and eventually does take it. Questions so far? I will take that as a no. I've sat in those chairs. I know no one wants to speak up for everyone else, so I will go on, and feel free to stop me. All right, so there's a couple of possible ways to think this. So you can think about Elijah, right? What we read here, he said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Then they say, oh, it's Elijah. Let's give him some wine vinegar. There seems to be maybe some kind of connection with Elijah, or maybe that's just a reply to that Eloi, Eloi. Maybe they thought it was Elijah, or something like that, right? Actually interesting. So Elijah means my God is Yahweh. So if they thought that, instead of hearing my God, why have you forsaken me, the crowds may have heard him say, my God is Yahweh, my God is Yahweh. Interesting side note. Maybe they were thinking about back in 1 Kings when Elijah raised someone from the dead, right? Jesus was dying, he was almost dead. And they're saying, oh, Elijah needs to come and raise him from the dead. Or maybe you're thinking about the prophecy in Malachi, where Elijah would have to return before the Son of Man and before this day of destruction. Also, in Psalm 69, and you can look there and you'll see that Psalm 69, verse 21, it was prophesied that Jesus would be given this bitter drink, this wine vinegar. All right? There's no real details given around that. It's mentioned almost in passing. They gave me vinegar to drink. Okay, so that's something to note, that this was prophesied way back in the Psalms, 1,000 years before. Other thoughts could be you had Boaz and Ruth. So actually, Boaz invites Ruth to dip bread into vinegar, and that's when he accepted Ruth, when she dipped the bread into the vinegar. So maybe there's something with redemption, something like that. But to me, at least, none of those really got at it. There's a lot of questions. They don't really make sense. And why is this so important? Okay? So let's look deeper. Vinegar in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word is chrometz. It's used only 5 times, all right? So I'm going to show 3 verses. So the first, and this is the one that looks weird on your handout. The first is Proverbs chapter 10, verse 26. It says, like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the lazy one to those who scent it. All right. Next verse, Proverbs 25, verse 20. These are all along the same line. Like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, or like vinegar on soda, is he who sings songs to a troubled heart. Similar thought. And then one more verse, Numbers chapter 6, verse 3. This is about a Nazirite. He shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar, whether made from wine or strong drink. Nor shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh or dried grapes. So these are all negative things about vinegar, right? Vinegar to the teeth, trying to sing to a person who's troubled, not being Nazarites, abstaining from it. These are not positive things that's connected with vinegar. And there's some other things with that. So with vinegar, there's a negative connotation, but also it wasn't just vinegar that was given to Jesus. For example, we read that vinegar was mixed with gall. All right, that's from Matthew. And gall is a very bitter concoction. And again, throughout the Old Testament, there's negative connotations. This gall it's not a pleasant, happy thing. All right, for lack of a better word, we can call it bad. Bad connotations, bad connections, bad associations with gall. Also, myrrh. So I know you guys had a class from John Popel a couple weeks ago. Do you remember what he said about myrrh? Death. He said death. Yep. So in Proverbs 7, it's actually all over the Bible, but one example is in Proverbs 7, there's an adulterous woman who covers her bed with myrrh. And the verse that says about it is, her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. All right? And you embalmed bodies with myrrh. Again, probably not the best connotations for a word. Again, bad is a bad word, but it's connected with death. Again, not really a cheery symbol. What else? So even that word mixed. So when the Bible says the vinegar was mixed with gall and when it was mixed with myrrh, it's a very unique word. The only times it was used is referring to this, and then a couple other ones. Look at Luke chapter 13, verse 1. And I'm going to run away and get a drink of water while you're looking that up. Luke 13, 1. So Luke chapter 13, verse 1. Now on that same occasion, there were some present who reported to him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. And you can look into it, but when it says Pilate mixed their blood with the sacrifice, what it means is that Pilate killed a bunch of people, all right? While they're doing sacrifices, he murdered a bunch of people. That's what that mixing is referring to. There's 2 other uses with mixing. They're both from Revelation. Hail and fire are mixed with blood in Revelation 8. And Revelation 15:2, the sea of glass mixed with fire. Again, not a stretch to say these are negative connotations, negative associations with this word mixed. How about another one? We have leaven, all right? So vinegar, the Hebrew word is chrometz. and the root word of that, so the word chometz is derived from chametz, which is leaven. All right? So let's think about leaven. How is leaven presented in the Bible? So during the sacrifices in the Old Testament, leaven was not allowed to be around. Go to the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus. All right? The book of Leviticus. So the book of Leviticus is all, the first couple chapters are all about the sacrifices. So chapter 2, verse 11, for example, no grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall not offer up in smoke any leaven or any honey as an offering by fire to the Lord. All right, so when you had a grain offering, a good thing, you could not have any leaven with it. All right, and there's a bunch of references like that. There's only one exception, and it's in Leviticus 7. This is kind of an interesting side note that you can take note of. So there's only one type of sacrifice where they could have leaven in the sacrifice. It's Leviticus chapter 7, verses 11 and 13. It's the peace offerings. Now this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which shall be presented to the Lord. If he offers it by way of thanksgiving, then along with the sacrifice of thanksgiving, he shall offer unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil, and cakes of well-stirred fine flour mixed with oil. With the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving, he shall present his offering with cakes of leavened bread. All right, so it's kind of interesting. You think about a peace offering, it's reconciliation, right? There's a quote here. They were called peace offerings because in them, God and his people did, as it were, feast together. Sorry about Joanna. The peace offerings were offered by way of supplication. If a man were in pursuit of any mercy, he would add a peace offering to his prayer point. So what we have is a juxtaposition of holy and unholy, leavened bread and unleavened bread. So this leaven is contrasted with the holy unleavened bread. So again, negative uses of leaven, or negative associations. Other examples, you think about the New Testament, Jesus warns against the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, he talks about the Corinthians and their tolerating sexual immorality. And Paul says, do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. So he's using leaven as an analogy for sin. He says, get rid of the sin so that you can be holy. And in Galatians later, he says that same exact thing. He says, cleanse the leaven from you. Then last thing is Deuteronomy chapter 16. I think we're pounding this point home that whatever this was that was offered to Jesus had a whole bunch of negative symbology behind it. So Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 3 to 4. This is talking about the Passover, all right? You just had a Passover meal, right? A couple of weeks ago?
Yes.
Did you have leavened bread at that, or was it unleavened?
Unleavened.
Oh, well done. So Deuteronomy 16, verse 3 and 4. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat with it unleavened bread, the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, so that you may remember all the days of your life, the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. For 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh which you sacrifice on the evening of the first day shall remain overnight until morning. All right, so again, the lesson here is that during the Passover you couldn't have leaven. So what's unique is that when Jesus is crucified, it was the Passover. That's the timing. And Jesus was the Passover lamb. And Jesus has offered leaven. He's offered vinegar, leaven. He's offered myrrh, death. It's mixed with these things, with these negative, sinful things. But Jesus accepts it, right? What's weird is at first Jesus refuses it, but no, Jesus actually accepts this. So this is very, very interesting. If he's offered all these negative things, what's going on? All right, and he not only accepts it, in John's account, he asks for it. He asks for the wine. So I hope you see the problem here, or problem that Scripture is presenting. It's saying we have this liquid, this concoction of badness, right? Negative symbols being offered to the perfect man, Jesus Christ, at his death. And you think, this is where the main character, he rises above it, right? No, he takes it and even asks for it. So start thinking, what could this leaven, this wine, this vinegar, this bad liquid, this mixture, this concoction, this blend, this cup represent? And I think for me, that was the aha moment when we think about cup, right? So Jesus is being offered a cup of this wine vinegar. Now, when we think about cup, that brings a lot of things to mind. So think about the Garden of Gethsemane. All right, flip over back to the Gospels, the book of Matthew. So the book of Matthew, and we have some words about a cup. Right before Jesus' crucifixion, he talks about a cup being presented to him. That's interesting. So Matthew 26, starting at verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. This is the most stressful, most crucial, most critical time in his life up to this point. He said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." And he prays again. Skip over to verse 42. He went away a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." So he's struggling in this garden. He's praying for a long time. There's this cup, Father. He says, "Father, there's this cup that you want me to drink. I don't want to drink it. Give me another option. All right, is there any way this can pass from me?" He works through that and eventually comes to the point of acceptance where he says, "Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." In other words, I will drink this cup. That's what he decides. So when you think about what this cup is that he's talking about, the most common interpretation, it has to do with wrath. All right, so the common thought is that God is a vengeful, he's an angry, wrathful God with just pent-up wrath, just waiting to pour up this cup on Jesus. And Jesus is going to have to take all the wrath of the world for the sins of mankind. There's parts of truth to that, but it doesn't get the full picture. Because because God is not just a God of wrath, right? He's merciful, he's gracious, he's loving. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. That doesn't sound like a God of wrath, right? That's not really his true nature. But what I would submit is that this cup that Jesus is praying about, it represents God's plan for humanity, right? It represents God's plan for the world. And that does have elements of wrath in it, right? Because the world is sinful. So this cup is judgment for the sins. We sin, the world has sinned. God has prepared his plan as a result of that is judgment, okay? And that's what's going on. There's a lot of prophecies like this. Later, after Peter cuts off Malchus, the high servant's ear, Jesus says, "Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" Or earlier, he's talking to James and John in Matthew 20. He says, "Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." He said to them, "My cup you shall drink, but to sit at my right and my left, this is not mine to give." Now that's interesting, because that means this cup is not only for Jesus. Because he says, James and John, you guys are going to drink of this cup also. All right, and I think that fits with this thought of this being God's plan. So God, what is your plan for James and John? Well, it's awfully similar to what his plan was for Jesus, which was death in this case. Now again, there is doom and wrath as part of this cup. Let's look up some examples of this. Go to Psalm 75. And the whole point, trying to understand what is this cup that Jesus prayed about in the Garden of Gethsemane. So Psalm chapter 75, verses 4 to 8. I said to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not lift up the horn. Do not lift up your horn on high. Do not speak with insolent pride. For not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the desert comes exaltation. But God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another. For a cup is in the hand of the Lord, and the wine foams. It is well mixed, and he pours out of this. Surely all the wicked of the earth must drain and drink down its dregs. So we have one of the same connections. We have a cup, we have wine, same thing at the cross, and we also have mixing, same thing, right? And it's for the wicked of the earth. In other words, God is the judge, and for the wicked of the earth, this is not going to be pretty judgment. You don't have to turn here. Jeremiah 25, verses 15 to 16 says, for thus the Lord, the God of Israel, says to me, take this cup of wine of wrath from my hand, and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. They will drink and stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among you. Again, negative connotations with this cup. Or later, let's look up one in Revelation. All right, Revelation chapter 14. This cup comes back. So it's back in the Old Testament. It's in the Garden of Gethsemane. And now it's also in Revelation. Revelation chapter 14, verses 9 to 11. Then another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, and anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength of the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone, and in the presence of his holy angels and in the presence of God. Cheery stuff, right? Again, we have a cup, we have wine, we have mixing. These elements keep on coming back. The thought of what is God's plan for humanity? Well, if you're someone who, here in the Revelation narrative, you're worshiping the beast in his image, your cup is torment. It's the wrath of God. That's what God has a plan for those who disobey him. All right? We don't like to think about this. We don't like to think about what happens for the people who reject God, but there is judgment. There is a time to answer to the Lord. Yet Jesus consents to this, right? He consents to taking the cup. First in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, yes, I will do it if there's no other way. But also we have this connection where he does it on the cross, where he's finally offered this cup, this wine vinegar, and he takes it. All right? It's actually kind of an interesting thought, but at the Lord's Supper, there's also a cup of wine. Think about that one, how that may fit in. Right, so in the Old Testament, God had a cup prepared for the nations, where they would drink what was coming for them. To them, it just happened to be of wrath and judgment. For Jesus in Gethsemane, not wanting the cup was equivalent to not wanting what God had in store for him, death and suffering. And you can't blame him, right? This is very, very significant. We can't underestimate just how big this was for Jesus to accept death and suffering. He was a perfect man. This is a gospel message. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf. Jesus accepted this cup for us. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have to account for our own sins. No, we have to take up our own cross also, right? Jesus says that. But Jesus is drinking judgment on our behalf, not in place of us, but for us, for our benefit. So he hadn't sinned, he drank the cup for the sins of mankind. And that's why he's the sacrificial lamb, right? He's our savior. And this true meaning of cup, this plan for the world, what God had prepared for it, really comes through in one more passage in Psalm 116. This is the crux of it. So Psalm chapter 116, Psalm 116. A lot of these same themes will come through, but the cup is different. Psalm 116, starting at verse 12. For what shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits towards me? I shall lift up the cup of salvation. So here it's the cup of salvation, and call upon the name of the Lord. I shall pay my vows to the Lord. Oh, may it be in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his godly ones. O Lord, surely I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You've loosed my bonds. To you I shall offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving and call upon the name of the Lord. I shall pay my vows to the Lord. Oh, may it be in the presence of all his people. In the courts of the Lord's house, in the midst of you, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord. This psalm is completely full of the imagery at the cross, right? Paying your vows. You vowed in the Garden of Gethsemane, I will take this cup. The presence of all his people, everyone was around him, and he proclaimed, Father, into my hands I commit your spirit. Verse 15, the death of his godly ones. Well, that somewhat relates to the cross, I would think. Surely, Lord, I am your servant. You look at Isaiah 53, and all throughout the servant songs in Isaiah, this is Jesus. Verse 17, a sacrifice of thanksgiving. That's what Jesus' life was, and his death, a sacrifice of thanksgiving. But what's different is that it's a cup of salvation, because God has prepared a plan not only for judgment, but his plan for the world includes salvation. This cup culminates in the death of his servant, who chose death in the presence of all his people as a way to obey God. And it's a way of salvation for us. And each week on Sundays, we're invited to drink of this cup. We're told to remember Jesus' blood. We're told to remember Jesus' death and his sacrifice. So in drinking this cup, Jesus is saying, yes, I take this cup. I will die for the sin of the world, for the sin of Adam, for the sin of humanity. Questions up to this point? All right, let's go on, because there's one problem with this, which is, yes, he does drink this cup at the end, but he refused it several times, right? On the road, again, the chronology is a little bit not convoluted, but it's not crystal clear, but he's offered it and doesn't take it. Now, we can realize that as the timeline marches on, first he doesn't even take it, then he tastes it and doesn't, then we're not really sure in Luke, then he does take it, so he gets closer and closer to taking this cup, but he starts out by not taking the cup and refusing it. So how does that make sense? In the Garden of Gethsemane, he had already said, yes, I will take this cup. So to kind of answer this, I have to draw upon one of my favorite psychologists. I know you guys have heard me talk about this at the back. Daniel Kahneman is his name. He's the only Nobel Prize winner in economics who was not an economist. So what he said was brilliant. No one had ever thought about it before. What he said was, people don't always do what they say they're going to do. All right, if you come up with a statement like that, you too can win a Nobel Prize. But the thought of people not always doing what they say they're going to do, that's what the foundation of economics is. It's called rational choice. The thought is, if one thing gives me 10 utils, $10, 10 whatever, and another thing gives me 5, I'm going to take the 10. Well, what he said is, no, that doesn't actually happen. We think we will take the 10, but we don't always do what we say we're going to do. And what I would propose is that Jesus in the garden, he did decide, I'm going to do the Father's will. I'm going to take this cup. But he still had to follow through with it, right? He still had to actually drink this cup. And all on his journey to the cross, God, he tested him in a way that furthers Jesus' growth. All right? So a cup keep on being presented to Jesus. Jesus, take this wine vinegar. No. Someone else comes up, take this sour wine. Taste it. No. Later, take this. I'm not really sure. And then finally, at the very end, he says, yes, please give me this cup. I'm ready to drink. I'm ready to die on behalf of the world. And I would argue that Jesus was struggling with doing what he said. And it's counterintuitive. We think of Jesus as being perfect and always perfect. Yet this crazy guy on the West Coast is saying that he didn't want to drink that cup that God had prepared for him. But this isn't a surprise. He had prayed in the garden, if you can, take this from me. Right? And throughout his life, we see Jesus increasing in wisdom and increasing in stature and increasing in favor with God and man. That's said multiple times in the book of Luke. So Jesus is a human. He grows, right? He wasn't born perfect. He had to face trials that were not easy to overcome. He was a human, a man, just like you and I. We can't overestimate how difficult this task was, this accepting of the judgment for sins, right? And I would argue that he wasn't ready in his mind to take this cup. He waited until the very end to see if God would provide another way, just like Abraham and Isaac, right? He waited to see if God would provide another way. God sent him a bunch of different people offering him this physical reminder of the spiritual cup that he had to take. Jesus knew what was happening. The question was he ready to drink the cup? So one last thing with this, I want to look at Jesus' mindset on the cross, all right? There's a thought that I like. So when Jesus says on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, that's from Psalm chapter 22, verse 1. And then his final words that he says is, Father, into your hands I commit your spirit. And that's in Psalm 31, verse 5. So a thought could be that while he was on the cross, his mind was working through these psalms. So when you're reading Psalm 22 to 31, read it with Jesus on the cross in mind. It becomes incredibly powerful because these psalms are all about trusting in God. They're all about deliverance and all about healing. So Jesus is going through these psalms saying, do I have to? Is there another way? Why? Right? I mean, think about Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He restores my soul. Even the verse that my cup overflows, right? Used in a different way. It's all about trusting God. And I would argue that from these psalms, Jesus draws his strength, where he decides, it is okay. God, I am going to trust you. I am going to drink this cup. Whatever happens as a result of me drinking this cup, into your hands I commit my spirit. So though he was innocent of sins, he does decide to take the cup. So he finally says in John, I am thirsty. Then finally, after all these negative symbols, the wine vinegar is offered to him on a branch of hyssop, a holy concept. Hyssop. Think about cleanse me with hyssop in the Old Testament. You know, before he was offered to it by soldiers who were mocking him, passerbys, rudely insulting him. But now he's offered it in a different light because it's now this cup of salvation. The story is not just doom and gloom and wrath. There's salvation. There's a positive light. And it shows us just how wonderful this act, this sacrifice is, dying for us. So he drinks the cup right before his final death. And in doing so, he finally accepts and submits to God's will. When he does this, he says, it is finished. And it was finished. He committed to dying for our sins and accepting the judgment, being the scapegoat, we'll talk about next week, a sacrificial lamb. So all this to say that when the Bible talks about this wine vinegar, I don't think it's just, oh, Jesus was having a problem with the pain, or he was a little bit thirsty. You know, we're going to interrupt this for a moment to have a drinking break. No, this is Jesus deciding in the moment, okay, I'm going to offer myself as a sacrifice. I will take this cup and trust you, God. So next week, we're going to look at a different event, another heavy hitter that really teaches us a lot about Jesus. We're going to look at how the Roman soldiers divided his clothes amongst themselves. Okay, there's some really interesting things that deal with the Romans themselves and how Jesus interacted with them. Questions, comments, concerns?
I want to ask, why is hyssop mentioned only one time?
Why is what mentioned only one time?
Why is hyssop mentioned only one time in all those accounts?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also only in John's account that Jesus says, I'm thirsty. And all the rest, they're given to him. So John, for whatever reason, seems to be attuned to the fact that Jesus is asking for this cup. And that's where it is presented with hyssop, this holy type of, we'll call it vehicle for giving the cup. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it does.
Because we did a class a few weeks ago that, who was it?
Jonathan Midget.
Yeah, and he mentioned hyssop, and then I brought up John 19.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's neat. Very neat. Thanks, Alaric.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking that too, because John says Jesus asked for it in order that the scripture might be fulfilled.
Yep.
Jonathan's class, he went into great detail to explain to us how in the law in Leviticus, the hyssop, the cedar, and the scarlet always were together in their offerings. And that foreshadowed the work of Christ. Therefore, this hyssop may be part of why he wasn't, because he had the scarlet robe on. Needed the hyssop to somehow be involved, and the cedar was the cross was the connection he was making.
Yeah. Or the scarlet could even be that cup also, I would argue.
Or his blood.
Right, or that. Yep.
That was a beautiful thing you put together. I've connected that before, but not the way you put it together. It was really good.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Other questions, thoughts?
Very good. Jesus refused the wine. That's John, they accepted.
Sorry, Paul, it's coming through a little bit scratchy. Can you speak up a little bit? Sorry.
Jesus refused drink the wine. Refused.
Why did he refuse it?
Yeah, then that's John. He accepted the wine. Why?
I think at first he wasn't ready to take it. I think it was a big deal. He wasn't ready to die yet. That's what I would argue. He still had to get to that point to trust God 100%. And finally in John, he's at that point where he trusts God, takes the cup to fulfill the scriptures, and says it's finished. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Anything else?
Nathan, I have just heard that there was some sort of medicinal value to it, like it would have numbed his pain, and that he rejected it at first so that pain wasn't numbed, like.
Right. Yeah, and maybe.
Suffer, but he wanted, he wanted to not be medicated at all.
Right. And I don't think that's wrong. That seems like a weak kind of, a small type of thing to be featured so prominently in this crucifixion scene. That's my thought.
I agree. I'm just saying I've heard that put out there as a suggestion.
Right.
But in John, it says when he realized that it was already finished or accomplished, when all things had been accomplished, then he accepted it. So,
Well, yeah, he asks for it first in John, right? He says, "I'm thirsty," and then it's finished in verse 30. But yes, yeah, you're right.
in 28, he says, knowing that all things had been accomplished.
Yes, yeah, I gotcha.
Then he says, I'm thirsty. So maybe
Yep.
he was right on the verge of dying, and I don't know.
Well, actually, we're going to talk about that verse. I think that connects with the previous verses, which is, why are the women at the cross? All right, so he gives away John to Mary and says, everything's been complete now. And we're going to talk about that. I think that's the last class we're going to do. But again, maybe it all connects. I don't know. But we'll talk about that more later. Other thoughts?
I think that's it for tonight, Nathan. Thank you.
All right, I can say a prayer to close. Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for your word, for your son, Jesus. We had the chance to think about your servant, Jesus Christ, our Savior, all that he gave up and all his trust in you. Help us to model his life. Help us to give up our life every day in a sacrificial way in order to trust you. It's in your son's name that we pray. Amen.
All right, Daniel, well, thank you very much.
Thank
We
you much.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Lord willing, well, actually, Dan and I won't be here next week, but everybody else will see you next week, so.
Sounds good. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Okay, good night.
See ya.